In addition to the advantages that basically the members of Congress give to themselves, because when you have something like the franking privileges, trips home, things like the behaviors that they actually follow, those are all things that they give themselves. It is Congress that actually allocates the money to allow themselves to travel back home for free or to use the franking privileges, to have the U.S. mail service take things sent from their office and do that for free. But in addition to that, there are other structural factors that make it easy for members of Congress who are there to run for reelection and to be successful in winning reelection. Some of this, again, we talked about because it has an influence on the ways in which the campaigns and elections works. We talked about that in Chapter 10. For example, incumbents have a lot more money for their campaigns, even though they don't have to spend money to send some of the campaign materials, even though they can have free trips home that will allow them to attend election functions. Uh, they also have they're more successful in raising money for their campaigns. In the House in 2014, it was a 10-to-1 advantage that incumbents had over their challengers. It's a 9-to-2 advantage in 2018. Similarly, in the U.S. Senate, it's a 6-to-1 advantage that the incumbents have and a 15-to-2 advantage in 2018. So considerably much more money available for those who are already in office and seeking reelection than their challengers. And so, if in fact the main way in which we find out about candidates is through TV ads and other things that cost quite a bit of money, then those individuals with more money are probably more likely to be successful. And so, again, it's that combination of money and incumbency is making it so that it will keep winning. And it's kind of self-fulfilling prophecy in many ways. The other thing is to think about it in terms of the perspective of we the voters. There's actually a disincentive for us to do what seems likely we would want to do, which is to throw the bums out. We'd like to get rid of them. We're unhappy with Congress. We'd like to have new ideas and new individuals in office. And so why don't we do anything about it? Because at the end of the day, the idea of democracy, the idea of popular sovereignty, is that we the people do have a say, and we have a say by voting. If we don't like or vote them out of office. But there is a strong disincentive to do that. And that is that the longer that a member of Congress is in office, the more in terms of the committees that they decide to sit on and what position they play in those committees. Incumbents have more power than the people who are just elected to Congress. And so because of that, individuals, when thinking about it, when voters are thinking about this, they could say, I'm really upset at my member of Congress. I want to throw her out of office, or I want to throw him out of office. But in doing so, if they think about it sort of from a rational expectations in terms of an economics viewpoint, it is actually going to punish their district or their state to get rid of this person because they're taking someone who has been in office for a while and is moving up the ladder of seniority, is better able to get on the committees that will deliver like a laser beam the goodies to the district and the state that matter most to the district and the state. And then we're going to replace it with an individual who's going to move to the bottom of the list in terms of a committee selection. And then you have that if a member is in office long enough, they become the chair of that committee or the ranking member of that committee, in which case they have considerable amount of control over the actions of that committee, how they debate bills, what sort of groups are invited to provide evidence in terms of oversight and input into the legislative process, all of which makes it that seniority and being able to choose the committees that will best help your district and your state is something that is really quite powerful. And it's a disincentive for us to throw the bums out. The best scenario for us is that other districts and states get so sick of their members of Congress that they get rid of them. So we have new people who come in, but we get to keep our incumbent because our incumbent will then move up even higher in the rank of seniority. So it is a bit of a problem that even though we do have the power to do something about it, even then there are disincentives to do it and it becomes even harder. And perhaps the most important one, and this applies to the House of Representatives most specifically because the United States Senate can't have district lines that are redrawn, but one of the biggest influences in terms of advantages that incumbents get is in the House of Representatives. We saw that they're more successful in the U.S. than they are in the U.S. Senate. And we want to think about why that might be. And to a large extent, it has to do with the way in which the district lines are drawn for the House of Representatives. And it leads to a process called gerrymandering. And rather than have me explain it, I think that John Oliver on Last Week Tonight did a really good episode talking about gerrymandering from a few years ago. This episode comes from a few years ago. And then we also have an update about what the U.S. Supreme Court has just ruled in terms of gerrymandering. So I'm asking you to take a look at his video about gerrymandering to explain what gerrymandering is and the dangers of it and why it occurs that way. But just as a brief overview, gerrymandering comes from, again, an efficient and a constitutional requirement, and it's one we know that is being debated pretty extensively, is the idea of the census. Every 10 years, according to the U.S. Constitution, we must have a census that counts everyone in the United States. And then, because populations will move, they'll move within a state, they'll move one state to another, it can influence the number of seats that are given to a state for the House of Representatives, going way back to Chapter 2 when we talk about the U.S. Constitution, saying that the population is going to determine how many seats you get in the U.S. House of Representatives. In addition to that, even if you don't lose or gain an actual member of Congress because of the population changes, it can move within the state because each district needs to be about the same size in terms of not geography, but in terms of the number of people who are there. To have political equality, the U.S. Supreme Court in the early 1960s ruled that we need to have basically the same size districts as much as possible. But how those district lines are drawn is left to the states, first of all. The states, according to the U.S. Constitution, are the ones that get to decide how electoral laws are going to be drawn, even for elections for the federal government. And so in most states, we have that process of drawing the district lines is done by the partisan state legislatures. Democrats, Republicans control, in a lot of states, they control either Democrats control the state legislature or the Republicans control the state legislature. And so if the Democrats control it, they will try to draw the district lines in such a way as to make it so there are as many Democratic members of the House of Representatives as possible. If Republicans control the process of drawing the district lines, they will try to control that process. And so this idea of having to draw the district lines has reason. There's a really efficient reason and a constitutionally mandated reason that we need to do that. But again, politicians use it as a way to give themselves a partisan advantage whenever possible. And take a look at the video. It's about 20 minutes long, but there's a lot of good details explaining the process and explaining the implications of those things. It's a reminder that we want to add is that California does things differently. California and some other states have decided to take the process of drawing the district lines away from elected officials, and instead they're using other means. Some places use retired judges to draw the district lines. In California, instead, we have a Citizens Redistricting Board. It's made up of 14 members. 5 are Democrats, 5 are Republicans, and 4 are independents or decline to state their political party preference. And then all decisions must be majority decisions, which means that no one political party can dominate the drawing of the district lines. It is true for the district lines for the U.S. House of Representatives, but it is also true for the district lines for the California Senate and the California Assembly. And so the idea of the Citizens Redistricting Board is to take the process away from politicians and to make it, hopefully, to keep together communities of interest that have historically held together or are held together because they are one place. So Alan Lowenthal basically represents Long Beach. Instead of in the past, before the Citizens Redistricting Board, we had the process where part of Long Beach was Lowenthal's district, but part of Long Beach was in a district that Dana Rohrabacher, who is still who just lost in 2018, but Dana Rohrabacher, a very conservative Republican, held the district that included a sliver of Long Beach. It gave Dana Rohrabacher more conservative voters. It took a very conservative part of Long Beach. But it also gave him the opportunity to get involved in LA County politics because his district covered mostly Orange County, but then also a little sliver of LA County. And then he had a justification to say, well, some of my constituents live in LA County. I want to be involved in the process there. That has changed. So now Alan Lowenthal's district is mostly Long Beach. And we try to keep them held together that way. One other update is that the U.S. Supreme Court just recently ruled in a 5-4 controversial decision, said that gerrymandering is something that they recognize, that partisan gerrymandering, particularly done by Republicans after the 2010 midterm elections, 2010, the new census was held. Republicans then held the majority in a large number of state legislatures. They had state governors who were Republicans, and then the Constitution required the census, and so the redistricting process had to be done. And so Republicans wrote the district lines in such a way as to give Republicans a huge advantage. There was a court case that included Maryland, that Maryland, dominated by Democrats, tried to do something similar. So people can argue that there is sort of equivalency, but others turn around and say the Republicans were much better at it, much more organized, much more deliberate in doing this. But the argument is that gerrymandering, particularly if you take the observation that African Americans, and to a lesser extent Latinos and Asian Americans, generally vote for Democrats. And if you take that information and you draw the district lines in such a way using the idea of race as a way to draw the district lines to get a partisan outcome, that could be seen as a violation of the U.S. Constitution, a violation of political equality, because you're using race to decide where people are put into particular districts. And the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that that is unconstitutional. If it's based on race, that is problematic because it violates the 14th Amendment. But at the same time, the politicians, when they were drawing the district lines after 2010, were very clear that this was done for a partisan advantage. And the U.S. Supreme Court, up until 2019, hadn't ruled about whether or not partisan redistricting would be allowed. And in the end, the U.S. Supreme Court, in a 5-4, yet again controversial decision, basically said it's pretty sleazy what politicians are doing, that they are using this to get a partisan advantage, but they basically said, what can the courts do about it? Politicians are going to be politicians. We saw that in the vicious cycle of non-participation, and the U.S. Supreme Court is like, yep, it's very partisan. What can we do about it? That's what politics is about. Not everyone on the U.S. Supreme Court agreed with that. Elena Kagan, Associate Justice on the U.S. Supreme Court, read her minority opinion from the bench and was basically crying about this and really was upset and said that the Supreme Court is abdicating its fundamental responsibility. In her belief, the U.S. Supreme Court is meant to do something like this, that they are supposed to intervene and to take a look at the maps that are drawn by state legislatures and to figure out whether or not those are constitutional, particularly if they violate the Equal Protection Law of the 14th Amendment. And she has said even recently that this is going to be a decision she will never forget. So it is still ripped from the headlines. It's still up for debate. We have the census coming in 2020 to see what are the Democrats and Republicans going to do. How many state houses do they win? And what do they do with that power?